Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Amari's Revenge. The goddess next door is confronted by a Nubian queen out for revenge at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in this inaugural Isis series adventure. Get your copy of Isis, Amari's Revenge in paperback and e-readers at Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Better get the coleslaw, y'all, cause we're having us a barbecue. A couple of months ago, comic book writer Mark Waid said that he wanted to see the comic book industry burn. And when he made that tweet on Twitter, it caused a firestorm of controversy among comic fandom. And as let's think about that statement he made on Twitter, I have to wonder if he's actually implementing that plan based on what I read in Absolute Power #1. Now, Absolute Power is DC Comics' event for 2024, and it may be the final event for DC Comics based on what I read in the first issue. Now, the Absolute Power storyline is supposed to be one where Amanda Waller is working with the Failsafe Batman program and the female Brainiac towards taking away all of the superpowers of all of DC's superheroes and being able to maintain control over the Earth as related to neutralizing all of the superheroes in the DC universe. And I have to wonder if this whole storyline, based on what I read in this absolutely terrible comic, is all part of Mark Waid's grand plan to see the comic book industry burn, because this whole story basically will lead to the complete final collapse of DC Comics after 16 years of Dan Didio that set the DC Comics on a road to its decline and its final collapse based on what I read in this one story. Now, DC Comics was doing very well even in the dark days of the complete collapse of the comic book industry in the 1990s. DC was pretty stable in spite of other companies winding up having issues like Marvel with its bankruptcy and many of the indie companies that wound up going out of business in the 90s when Marvel decided to go out here and buy Heroes World as related to trying to control distribution and the speculator market completely collapsing due to many books basically not really being able to maintain their value due to people realizing that it took time for comics to actually build value, and it was also a supply and demand issue because many books basically went up in value because comics were quickly thrown away or they were disposable for many people as related to their childhood, and they wanted to get those back issues. But a lot of people, when the speculator market crashed, DC was able to maintain its stability due to its New Earth continuity, having a lot of great legacy characters like Wally West Flash, Dick Grayson Nightwing, Kyle Rayner Green Lantern, the Catwoman series, and strong Batman and Superman sales thanks to writer Roger Stern. I mean, DC was doing exceptionally well in the 90s and had a lot of growth because they had really seasoned professionals in charge, such as Jeanette Kahn, who ran DC, and Karen Berger, who ran Vertigo and took Vertigo to another level as related to publication. I mean, a lot of innovative and great books came out of Vertigo, and that really stabilized DC in a very unstable comic book marketplace, and this allowed many comic shops to really thrive and grow because many of the DC books remain consistent. Unfortunately, in 2002, Jeanette Kahn wound up leaving and Paul Levitz wound up leaving DC Comics, and Warner Brothers, wanting to make DC synergize more with its movie and TV divisions, got TV executive Dan Didio and put him in charge of DC Comics, and Dan Didio had no publishing experience, and that's what basically started the decline of DC, as Dan Didio was looking to try to synergize DC with these movie and TV divisions, and also look to move DC's models away from DC heroes being the paragons of good and being symbols of hope, to taking the characters in a darker road based on the deconstructed story models of comic stories like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, not understanding that Watchmen, in and of itself, was a social commentary of what superheroes were not supposed to be like, and that's what Alan Moore clearly stated. And Dark Knight Returns was an alternate reality that most people, while it was popular with some comic fans, was not what we wanted to see in mainstream comics. And starting in 2002, we started to see the decline of DC Comics as they focused on making their heroes darker and edgier in stories like Graduation Day, where they killed off Teen Titans character Donna Troy with a Superman robot, and this followed up with Identity Crisis, a story that basically compromised the entire ethics of the DC universe and compromised the ethics of DC Comics characters, taking them off the road to being paragons and ideals of hope and turning them into twisted, unethical characters. And this wound up alienating a lot of comic fans. And over the course of the 2000s and the 2000s and over the 2000s, DC sales started to decline and the audience started to walk away from DC Comics until eventually we got to where Warner Brothers wanted to try to change the rights of these characters and maintain the rights of them by ending the old DC universe and giving us the New 52. Now, the New 52 didn't go over well with comic fans and basically started a second decline of the comic book industry. And the New 52 never really got over, and eventually they tried to dial it back with Convergence and then the DC Rebirth, but Didio came in once again and derailed the Rebirth, leading us to the Dawn of DC era, the Dawn of DC era that came after Dan Didio's termination, finally after Warner Brothers continued to hemorrhage money on its DC Extended Universe movies. DC Extended Universe movies didn't go over as well as they thought, and most of the movies didn't. They underperformed outside of Wonder Woman, Aquaman, and Shazam. The rest of them basically wound up failing at the box office, and Warner Brothers continued to struggle, eventually to the point where they wound up being bought by Discovery. And after they wound up being bought by Discovery, after AT&T wound up selling them, Warner Brothers is now on its last legs. And with Warner Brothers being on its last legs, I have to wonder if Mark Waid is looking to look around and looking to light the match to finally just end DC Comics once and for all. Because that's what I believe is happening here with this Absolute Power, a storyline that just comes off as completely ridiculous because the build-up to this story was absolutely awful. I mean, the failsafe Batman storyline has destroyed Batman's overall sales. Batman at one time was a book that was selling 6 to 7 figures based on the 1989 movie's popularity and maintained 6-figure sales even in the dark days of the 2000s. But towards this era of this Chip Zdarsky storyline, the sales have been dropping due to the failsafe storyline, which just makes and the Zen Arna nonsense. It just makes no sense. And basically, this is the book that's supposed to tie in the Absolute Power along with the Brainiac storyline and Superman. And all of this is basically leading up to this Mark Waid event, where Mark Waid, I believe, is subconsciously going out here and looking to implement a plan to light the fire that will lead to the comic book industry burning. Because if DC winds up collapsing due to the really poor sales, eventually the industry will be halfway towards its end. Because with Absolute Power #1, there was just the pre-orders were at an all-time low. Local comic shops, the ones that are surviving, nobody wanted to buy this book. And I have to wonder if this is all part of Mark Waid's plan to see the comic book industry burn, for him to go out here and write a story that's just this ridiculous, where you got Amanda Waller, a powerless black woman who is the head of the organization that she's a part of, whatever it is, and she's talking about she wants to work with the female Brainiac and Failsafe towards taking away all the heroes' powers so that she can get absolute control. And like Comics Matter, your boy Zach, who basically cooked this story by saying it's basically like looking at one of these black women at the DMV who wants to go out here, and this is the threat, and as related to your villain, it makes no logical sense whatsoever for two machines to be sitting there following the orders of a black woman. And the whole story, again, just really gets more and more ridiculous because not only do superheroes lose their powers, it's also people who are aliens and beings people that wield magic. I mean, you've got the Martian Manhunter, a guy from Mars, basically losing powers, which makes no sense. I mean, if this is supposed to be, I mean, this just makes no sense at all. And the whole idea of mystics like Zatanna and John Constantine losing their powers that they basically learned. I mean, magic goes outside of superpowers. And the whole idea of the Spectre, who's supposed to be the wrath of God, losing his powers. This just basically, the story is so bad. I mean, I have to wonder if Mark Waid is deliberately writing a terrible story to lead to the complete collapse of DC, because DC at this point has been on its last legs, and with DC being on its last legs, I have to wonder if Mark Waid basically wants to go out here and see the entire structure of DC finally go into a complete collapse and be able to sate his feelings for a moment, as related to this whole situation of DC Comics, because again, in that tweet a couple of months ago, he said he wanted to see the comic book industry burn, and this story basically will be the one that starts the fire that leads to DC collapsing, and with one of the big two basically on its way to starting to have this fire, eventually the cash-strapped Warner Brothers Discovery is eventually going to reach a point, because it's been rumored they want to end DC Comics. They want to end DC Comics because DC Comics is hemorrhaging money at this point as related to being a publishing division, because 90% of their books have been failing, and I'd say 99% of their books have been failing. I mean, even core books like Batman and Superman are struggling right now, and they're struggling to the point where even comic shops don't want to order stuff anymore, and they're not. And when it looks to DC right now at this point, I mean, DC is in the worst place it is, and I have to wonder if Mark Waid is no longer interested in writing superheroes, but wants to be a real-life supervillain who is looking to set DC on fire and start that fire that will lead to the complete burning of the comic book industry and leading to all of the comic book industry basically going out, because if DC goes out, basically half the industry is gone, and most comic shops basically aren't going to be able to survive because they're struggling right now because of garbage like Absolute Power and most of the trash produced over at places like Marvel, because we see over at the Marvel side, the X-Men relaunch ain't really going over as well as they anticipated. I mean, I remember when you said X-Men and people basically, they were out here ready to buy, but most people lost their enthusiasm for the X-Men after the end of the Krakoa saga in the most ignominious fashion. So I'm wondering if Mark Waid is really looking to get everything going as related to the end of comics and the comic book industry, because Absolute Power is the storyline that I believe is the absolute end. This storyline, along with Blood Hunt and the X-Men relaunch, basically are where we're headed towards rock bottom, where we may not see monthly comics anymore, and And what's sad is the man who won an award for writing the book Kingdom Come, which basically took comic book superheroes to another level, is the one who basically wants to see comic book superheroes basically fall on their face, and is looking to take the entire comic book industry out, not the medium of comics. I want everybody to get it clear. There's the comic book industry as related to DC and Marvel, but the medium of comics will go on, and sadly what will happen is all of those superhero comics and that era of superhero comics may be over, and we may be in for a long dark period, and the whole thing is it may be a dark period is ushered in by Mark Waid. Mark Waid, who again was one of the considered to be the greatest comic book writers of the 20th century. When you read books like his Flash run and stories like The Return of Barry Allen and Kingdom Come, he was truly a great writer at one time, but these days he basically is a pale shadow of himself, and because he's possibly frustrated that he won't be able to go on, he doesn't want the comic book industry to go on. Very boomerish thinking, because many baby boomers, they believe once they cannot go on, they don't want what to be preserved, so they want to destroy everything around them so somebody else can't build on it. So I look at this whole situation, and again, I keep repeating it, but I wonder if this is his way of destroying the comic book industry, because I don't see DC coming back from absolute power. I don't see DC bouncing back from this one. No, when I look at this story, I basically see it as the dusk of DC, and I see it as the end of the dawn of DC era. Now, some believe this would lead into a new Justice League comic book, but at this point, people just don't care about DC anymore. And if people don't care about DC, the only thing that DC has to offer now is basically licensing and merchandising, and that's something that can be done with another company. I mean, they can just basically end that publishing division, outsource those other 3,000 characters to be used in things like reprints and other things to maintain the trademarks. They can easily do that with other publishing divisions and basically lay off all that DC editorial staff that has basically been wasting people's time. Lay off all these incompetent writers who have basically not been able to craft good stories with these characters, and basically just look to close up the DC shop, because DC at this point is no longer stands for Detective Comics. It just stands for dysfunctional crap. And basically Mark Waid, being a dysfunctional person, again, as a boomer, basically wants to be the one who closes the door on DC Comics, and wants to close the door on a new generation of readers learning about these characters, because he can't write them at all. And he wanted to see this industry burn, and I believe that he basically started the fire with this absolutely craptacular comic, Absolute Power. Now, if you want to try out my first full comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, you can find that comic on Lulu.com right now in paperback by clicking the link in the description box, and you can get your own copy for the same price as it was on the 2022 Kickstarter. And if you want to try out my first digital comic, Esteem No Good Deed, you can get that comic on Kindle for 99 cents and on Amazon.com, along with the books of the SJS Direct Universe. You can get all of the books in the SJS Direct Universe, such as the ISIS series, the Esteem series, the John Haynes series, the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, my vampire novel, Eternal Night, my black sorority novel, The Thetas, and my black business novel, Recipe for Success. You can find all those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format, and you can find them all at other online booksellers like Draft the Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. If you want to help me be able to make my next full SJS Direct comic, you can send a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Esteem Horror in the Hamptons. The aspiring angel tries to escape a house of horrors in this action-packed, all-new Esteem series adventure. Get your copy of Esteem Horror in the Hamptons in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Now available on Lulu. John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the first John Haynes comic at Lulu.com today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.